Chapter 7. Fanged Noumena, Passion of the Cyclone. The supreme concept with which it is customary to begin a transcendental philosophy is the division into the possible and the impossible. But since all division presupposes a concept to be divided, a still higher one is required, and this is the concept of an object in general, taken problematically, without its having been decided whether it is something or nothing. What matters is not the enunciation of the wind, but the wind. Peter Hillmore's report for the Observer begins. As idle as a painted ship upon a painted ocean. The water is still now, almost unnaturally so, as if it was resting from its monumental act of carnage, exhausted by its orgasmic tidal surge. Nothing seems to move. The water, so savage last week, now laps gently round the bodies. Half embedded in the mud and very still, a child lies in the water, arms and legs stiffly outstretched, its body bloated by the heat, its face battered and bloody. Next to it lies the body of a calf, its eyes wide in final uncomprehending shock. A few yards away in the middle of the road lie the bodies of two dead fish, as if the sea had even turned on its own. The state of Bangladesh, until 1971 East Pakistan, is nestled in the delta complex of the Ganges and Brahmaputra rivers, and is amongst the poorest as well as the most densely populated regions of the earth. It is a country whose natural inheritance is a mixture of fertility and disaster, and whose people are exposed by their poverty to the unimpeded course of elemental forces, rendered naked before the storms. Since records began in the 18th century, at least 1.2 million Bangladeshis have been killed by cyclones, as many as 500,000 in the storm of 1970 alone. Cyclones are atmospheric machines that transform latent energy into angular momentum in a feedback process of potentially catastrophic consequence. Their conditions of emergence are a warm water surface, a latitude of at least 5 or 6 degrees deviation from the equator, such that the Coriolis effect is operative, a pronounced instability in the air column or a low surface pressure, and the absence or virtual absence of wind shear. When these conditions coexist, a cyclone can develop, over a period that normally lasts from 4 to 8 days. A large cyclone transfers 3.5 billion tons of air an hour from the lower to upper atmosphere, and releases energy in the order of 102 ergs every second. At the center of the cyclone is a still zone of low pressure known as the eye or core, which registers no radar echo, and which functions as the immobile motor of the storm's angular momentum or expressed energy. Large cyclones have the impact of immense explosions, and when they strike the coast of Bangladesh they leave a shock wave in the silt, throwing up numerous evanescent islands in the shallows of the Gulf of Bengal. Due to the general hunger for land, and the richness of the sediment that has been carried down to the sea, these fragile traces are enthusiastically occupied, rice is cultivated upon them, and fish harvested from their shores. It takes no great feat of imagination to envisage the fate of the peasants and fishermen clustered on these insubstantial ripples of earth when the cyclone returns, and instantaneously consumes the tenuous vestiges of previous ravages. The densely inhabited silt traces are not merely flooded, but utterly erased, as everything which had seemed solid is dissolved into the vortex of the storm. The people of the Bangladesh coast are episodically consumed by a harsh truth from which we can momentarily hide. Being a patriarchal faith, or doctrine of identity, the Islamic culture predominant in Bangladesh is no better a preparation for this liquidation than Judaism or Christianity would be. Nevertheless, an annihilation such as that of the cyclone, in which all stability is washed away and loss alone prevails, is not merely a disaster, but religion. Of the terrain of pure understanding, Kant says, "This domain is an island, enclosed by nature itself within unalterable limits. It is the land of truth, enchanting name. Surrounded by a wide and stormy ocean, the native home of illusion, where many a fog bank and many a swiftly melting iceberg give the deceptive appearance of farther shores, deluding the adventurous seafarer ever anew with empty hopes, and engaging him in enterprises which he can never abandon and yet is unable to carry to completion." Is not transcendental philosophy a fear of the sea? Something like a dike or a sea wall? A longing for the open ocean gnaws at us, as the land is gnawed by the sea. A dark fluidity at the roots of our nature rebels against the security of terra firma, provoking a wave of anxiety in which we are submerged, until we feel ourselves drowning, with representation draining away. Nihil ulterius incipit Kant. We are not amphibians, but belong upon solid earth. Let us renounce all strange voyages. The age of desire is past. The new humanity I anticipate has no use for enigmatic horizons, it knows the ocean is madness and disease. Let me still your ancient tremors, and replace them with dreams of an iron shore. Reason in its legitimate function is a defense against the sea, which is also an inhibition of the terrestrial, retarding our tendency to waste painstakingly accumulated resources in futile expeditions, a barrier opposed to the expenditure of forces as Bataille describes it. It is a fortified boundary, sealing out everything uncertain, irresolvable, dissolvent, a seawall against the unknown, against death. This is a structure continuous with the great land reclamation projects of Frederick II of Hohenstaufen, a matter of drainage, rigorous separation of the wet and the dry, eradication of marshes and ambiguous terrains, rigidification of the soil, the mosquitoes and other stinging insects that make the wilds of America so trying for the savages, may be so many goads to urge these primitive men to drain the marshes and bring light into the dense forests that shut out the air, and, by so doing, as well as by the tillage of the soil, to render their abodes more sanitary. Such terrestrialism reaches its zenith in Prussia's classic age, in the restriction of policy to continental ambitions. It is thus characterized by a certain hardness, a certain deliberate blindness towards death, as towards everything that flows freely like a wound. Unlike either Schopenhauer or Nietzsche, who in different ways seek to place themselves outside the ambit of an Occidental history dominated by the monotheistic order of the supreme object, and to connect with the East Asiatic zero that contests it, Bataille seems to resign himself to a struggle without refuge against the one. Far more even than Nietzsche, Bataille thinks of zero as a subtraction from one, as the death of God, and approaches it in anguish. In this way he aligns himself with a procedure of immense influence upon the course of European modernity, that of a progressive problematization from unity, harmonized with the dissolution of sedentary community. The most powerful example of such thinking is to be found in the cultural heartland of capital, which is to say, in the critical philosophy initiated by Kant. Bataille interrupts inner experience in order to make a few pages of remarks about Hinduism, in a section which ends with a technical argument designed to reinforce his claim to be no more interested in liberation from rebirth than in any other type of salvation. He compares the asceticism of Hinduism to that of Christianity, distancing himself from both in the name of excess, and pretends to no affinity with the naivety, the purity, of the Hindu. Perhaps most important of all is the affirmation of mess and inadequacy implicit in the words, "I do not doubt that the Hindus go far into the impossible, but to the highest degree they lack that which matters to me, the faculty of expression." It is because he is a writer that Bataille disdains to be a mystic. In what he understands of the Hindu religion, and he lays claim to no intimate knowledge of it, there is one tenet alone to which he unconditionally subscribes: only intensity matters. Inner experience translates mysticism into a vagrant vocabulary at the scurf edge of tradition. As the initial gesture of a Summa Theologica, it begins amongst the ruins of God. Echoing Celine, that other wretched tramp of nihilism, he calls experience a voyage to the end of the possible of man, and thinks interiority not as the secret recess of the self, but as a plane of contact and contagion. The core of inner experience is not personal identity, but naked intensity, denuded even of oneself, and jutting from the refuse of Christian dogmatics as a broken lurch into the unknown. He insists, inner experience is ecstasy whilst ecstasy is communication, opposing itself to the subsidence onto oneself. It is the order of the object that organizes inner experience as private reverie, and as a detachment from relation. Above all, it is the God of monotheism, the supreme or absolute being, which reproduces the prison of individuation at the scale of the cosmos. This is why the ecstasy of the unknown, which gnaws away the last landmarks from Bataille's voyage, contests any possible resurrection of theological edifices. As he remarks, "I hold the apprehension of God, even when formless and without mode, for an arrest of the movement which carries us to the more obscure apprehension of the unknown." An utter intoxication such as this is quite different from its Kantian anticipation, although Kant too contests the right of dogmatic theology to guide his journey. Nothing but the sobriety of a critique, at once strict and just, can free us from this dogmatic delusion, which through the lure of an imagined felicity keeps so many in bondage to theories and systems. Such a critique confines all our speculative claims rigidly to the field of possible experience, and it does this not by shallow scoffing at ever-repeated failures or pious sighs over the limits of our reason, but by an effective determining of these limits in accordance with established principles, inscribing nihil ulterius on those pillars of Hercules which nature herself has erected in order that the voyage of our reason may be extended no further than the continuous coastline of experience itself reaches, a coast we cannot leave without venturing upon a shoreless ocean which, after alluring us with ever-deceptive prospects, compels us in the end to abandon as hopeless all this vexatious and tedious endeavor. For Kant it is not enough to have reached the ocean, the shoreless expanse, the nihil ulterius as positive zero. He recognizes the ocean as a space of absolute voyage, and thus of hopelessness and waste. Only another shore would redeem it for him, and that is nowhere to be found. Better to remain on dry land than to lose oneself in there. Desolation of zero. It is for this reason that he says the concept of a noumenon is a merely limiting concept. In this way the Occidental obsession with the object consummates itself in the blind passivity of its nihilism. Beyond experience, it is suggested, there must be thought an unknown something, although we are unable to comprehend how such noumena can be possible. More precisely, the noumenon is not indeed in any way positive, and is not a determinate knowledge of anything, but signifies only the thought of something in general, in which I abstract from everything that belongs to the form of sensible intuition. That no transcendent object is found is an event which retains the sense of a lost or absent object, rather than that of a contact with all through objectlessness. The ocean has no sense except as a failure of the land. Even whilst supposedly knowing nothing of the noumenon, which, we are told, has no assignable meaning, one somehow still knows that it would be something other than objectless waste without end, or the void plane touched upon at zero intensity. Kant is peculiarly adamant in this respect. We cannot think of any way in which such intelligible objects might be given. The problematic thought which leaves open a place for them serves only, like an empty space, for the limitation of empirical principles, without itself containing or revealing any other object of knowledge beyond the sphere of those principles. The noumenon is the absence of the subject, and is thus inaccessible in principle to experience. If there is still a so-called noumenal subject in the opening phase of the critical enterprise, it is only because a residue of theological reasoning conceives a stratum of the self which is invulnerable to transition, or synonymous with time as such. This is the real or deep subject, the self or soul, a subject that sloughs off its empirical instantiation without impairment, the immortal subject of mortality. It only remains for Hegel to rigorously identify this subject with the death necessitated by the allergy of Geist to its finitude, to attain a conception of death for itself. But this is all still the absence of the subject, even when of is translated into the subjective genitive, and at zero none of it makes any difference. With Kant death finds its theoretical formulation and utilitarian frame as a quasi-objectivity correlative to capital, and noumenon is its name. The effective flotation of this term in philosophy coincided with the emergence of a social order built upon a profound rationalization of excess, or rigorous circumscription of voluptuous lethality. Once Enlightenment rationalism begins its dominion, ever fewer corpses are left hanging around in public places with each passing year, ever fewer skulls are used as paperweights, and ever fewer paupers perish undisturbed on the streets. Even the graveyards are rationalized and tidied up. It is not surprising, therefore, that with Kant thanatology undergoes the most massive reconstruction in its history. The clerical vultures are purged, or marginalized. Death is no longer to be culturally circulated, injecting a transcendent reference into production, and ensuring superterrestrial interests their rights. Instead, death is privatized, withdrawn into interiority, to flicker at the edge of the contract as a narcissistic anxiety without public accreditation. Compared to the immortal soul of capital, the death of the individual becomes an empirical triviality, a mere reallocation of stock. In the Aridity of the Sublime, in his third critique, Kant tentatively raises the possibility that we might taste death, even if only through a negative pleasure, but nowhere does he raise the possibility that death might savage us. Even when positivized as noumenon, death remains locked in the chain of connotations that passes through matter, inertia, femininity, and castration, resting in its pacified theistic sense as toothless resource and malleable clay. There is no place, no domain, for base matter in Kant's thinking, since even autogenerativity in nature is conceived as a regulative analogue of rational willing. One must first unleash the noumenon from its determination as problematic object in order to glimpse that between matter and death there is both a certain identity and an intricate relation, or, in other words, a unilateral difference appending matter to the edge of zero. Not that this complicity has anything to do with the inertia crucial to the mathematical idealization of matter, or with any other kind of mechanical sterility. Matter is no more simply dead than it is anything else, because simplicity is the operator of the transcendent disjunction between subject and object which effaces base materiality. The death proper to matter is the jagged edge of its impropriety, its teeth. If death can bite, it is not because it retains some fragment of a potency supposedly proper to the object, but because it remains uncaged by the inhibition objectivity entails. Death alone is utterly on the loose, howling as the dark motor of storms and epidemics. After the ruthless abstraction of all life, the blank savagery of real time remains, for it is the reality of abstraction itself that is time, the desert, death, and desolator of all things. Bataille writes of the ceaseless slippage of everything into nothing. If one wants time, and thinks of himself as a tooth of time, it could also be said, in a more Nietzschean vein, that zero becoming has its metaphor in a bird of prey, for which every object is a lamb. Repression always fails, but nowhere is there a more florid example of such failure than the attempt to bury death quietly on the outskirts of the city and get down to business. Only the encrusted historical superficies of zero are trapped in the clay, distilling death down to its ultimate liquidity, and maximizing its powers of infiltration. Marx notes this filtration process in Capital, where he remarks about money, death, that it does not vanish on dropping out of the circuit of the metamorphosis of a given commodity. It is constantly being precipitated into new places in the arena of circulation vacated by other commodities. Dead labor is far harder to control than the live stuff was, which is why the Enlightenment project of interring Gothic superstition was the royal road to the first truly vampiric civilization, in which death alone comes to rule. Politics is the archaic and inadequate name for something that must pass away into the religious history of capital. There are no effective anti-capitalist interests, but only anti-bourgeois desires in alliance with zero. The notorious asceticism of accumulative Protestantism already prefigures the suicide of the last ruling class, anticipating the definitive surrender of all humanity to death. Marx says in the Grundrisse, "The cult of money has its asceticism, its self-denial, its self-sacrifice, economy and frugality, contempt for mundane, temporal and fleeting pleasures, the chase after the eternal treasure." Hence the connection between English Puritanism, or also Dutch Protestantism, and money-making. Weber remarks, this asceticism turned with all its force against one thing, the spontaneous enjoyment of life and all it had to offer. This is the initial impulse into capital's religious history, the sacrifice of all dogmatic theology to the ascetic ideal, which is finally consummated in the death of God. The theology of the one, rooted in concrete beliefs and codes that summarize and defend the vital interests of a community, and therefore affiliated to a tenacious anthropomorphism, is gradually corroded down to the impersonal zero of catastrophic religion. In its early stages, capital is still a matter of self-control, but after a couple of centuries its rigid ethos withers away, because there is no effective self left to resist it. To quote Weber again, "Man is dominated by the making of money, by acquisition as the ultimate purpose of his life. Economic acquisition is no longer subordinated to man as the means for the satisfaction of his material needs. This reversal of what we should call the natural relationship, so irrational from a naive point of view, is evidently as definitely a leading principle of capitalism as it is foreign to all peoples not under capitalistic influence. At the same time it expresses a type of feeling which is closely connected with certain religious ideas. And the capitalistic economy of the present day, 1904-5, is an immense cosmos into which the individual is born, and which presents itself to him, at least as an individual, as an unalterable order of things in which he must live. It forces the individual, insofar as he is involved in the system of market relationships, to conform to capitalistic rules of action. The manufacturer who in the long run acts counter to these norms, will just as inevitably be eliminated from the economic scene as the worker who cannot or will not adapt himself to them will be thrown into the streets without a job. Once the commodity system is established, there is no longer a need for an autonomous cultural impetus into the order of the abstract object. Capital attains its own angular momentum, perpetuating a runaway whirlwind of dissolution, whose hub is the virtual zero of impersonal metropolitan accumulation. At the peak of its productive prowess, the human animal is hurled into a new nakedness, as everything stable is progressively liquidated in the storm. Bataille associates the unknown with a vertiginous movement towards the void, which he also describes as the rending fall into the void of the heavens, collapsing two themes into each other which Kant had strained to keep apart, those of Noumena and intensive zero. It is frequently suggested in the writings of the immediately post-Kantian generation that Kant illegitimately differentiates Noumena from each other, and Bataille shares a broadly Schopenhauerian impetus in his response to this issue. But it is not until Nietzsche that the differentiation between Noumena and zero is vigorously interrogated, and even then this is only undertaken in a sporadic and elliptical fashion. It is first of all Bataille, and later Deleuze, who respond to this matter with irresistible tenacity, and thus undercut the phenomenological stumblings that have been the more common retort to the Kantian challenge. Where Kant resists the conflation of Noumena from zero intensity, Bataille runs them convulsively into each other. All his writings, irrespective of whether they are marked by a predominantly literary or philosophical character, are cut up by oblivion, discontinuity, and incompletion. Zero alone cannot be fragmented, divided, or partitioned, being undifferentiability without unity, but the expense of this continuity for discrete being is without limit. We are not totally denuded except in going without fraudulence to the unknown. It is the part of the unknown which gives to the experience of God, or of poetry, their great authority. But the unknown demands in the end an empire without division. In the first critique Kant differentiates between four divisions of nothing, reciprocally correlated to the four classes of the categories. These are the ins rationis or empty concept without object, the nihil privativum or empty object of a concept, the ins imaginarium or empty intuition without object, and the nihil negativum or empty object without concept. It is the first of these nothingnesses which applies to the noumenon, as Kant writes. To the concepts of all, many, and one there is opposed the concept which cancels everything, that is, none. Thus the object of a concept to which no assignable intuition whatsoever corresponds is equals nothing. That is, it is a concept without an object, ins rationis, like noumena, which cannot be reckoned among the possibilities, although they must not for that reason be declared to be also impossible. Kant makes the indifferentiating gesture equals nothing in relation to the noumenon, but only amongst a systematic obliteration of illimitable zero, crushing it under the categories of the object which, according to their four classes, stamp it with inverse features of mathematical unity, semantic definition, substantial reciprocity, and logical identity. It is crucial to the historical force of Bataille's thought of sacrifice that it contests both the general tendency of this Kantian articulation and each of its particular elements. Rather than sharing the features of subtraction, deprivation, impotence, and dialectic, which Kant allots to the four aspects of nothing, sacrifice characterizes zero as undifferentiably pre-unitary, extravagant, unilateral, and impossible. The noumenon is not primarily an epistemological problem, but a religious one. Bataille writes that a sort of rupture, in anguish leaves us at the limit of tears, thus we lose ourselves, we forget ourselves and communicate with an ungraspable beyond. When he adds that the sole truth of man, finally glimpsed, is to be a supplication without response, it is not being suggested that a reference to alterity is inherent to experience in a phenomenological fashion, but rather, that experience is immanent to the trajectory of loss or sacrifice, in terms of which it is a real modification or imitation. The relation of the known to the unknown is unilateral not reciprocal, following the pattern of the difference between restricted and general economy. Zero is exploded into general economy, in which death is in a sense a deception because there is no privacy at zero, only the undifferentiable cosmic desert, impersonal silence, a landscape touched upon only in the deepest abysses of inhuman effect. Despair is simple. Bataille writes, it is the absence of all hope, of every lure. It is the state of desolate expanses and, I can imagine of the sun. This is the terrain of immanence or the unknown, positive death as zero intensity, unilaterally differentiated from ecstasy or naked sensation. It is the whole ramshackle complex associated with the taste of death in Bataille's writings, leading him to remark in inner experience, for instance, I remain in intolerable unknowing, which has no issue other than ecstasy itself. Throughout his writings Bataille implicitly or explicitly repeats a deft materialist gesture, indicating the transcendent dogma does not lie in the positing of an outside to experience, but rather, in the positing of experiences dissociated from its slide into oblivion. Experience can never comprehend or define dissolvent immanence, and the claim that it might can be symptomatologically interpreted as the consequence of a utilitarian reconstruction into objectivity. It is thus that Bataille reiterates Nietzsche's diagnosis concerning the moral basis of epistemology. The very possibility of a problem about the relation between experience and the real, requiring a theory of representation, presupposes the deformation of experience in terms of the good, or, in other words, the stable, isolated, and determinate, correlated to the caging of noumenon in the form of the object. In wild variance to the basic presupposition of overt or cunning idealism, experience is not given in reality as knowledge, but as collapse. Just as Kant domesticates the noumenon by defining it as an object, so he domesticates zero intensity by conceiving it as pure consciousness. The vestigial traces of the subject-object relation, that is of epistemology, constrain the movement of inner experience by substantializing a pole of knowing and a pole known, even at pure intuition equals zero. It is to refuse such constraints that Bataille insists that, experience finishes by attaining the fusion of subject and object, being a knowing subject, like unknown object, and remarks of oneself that this is not the subject isolated from the world, but a place of communication, fusion of subject and object. In this shift from the transcendental idealist treatment of zero to that of base materialism there is a difference of seismic consequence. The discussion of zero intensity in Kant's schematism, for instance, is securely framed by an immunized inner sense, and characterized by the idealistic structures of representation and reversibility. Now every sensation has a degree or magnitude whereby, in respect of its representation of an object otherwise remaining the same, it can fill out one and the same time, that is, occupy in a sense more or less completely, down to its cessation in nothingness, equals zero equals negatio. There therefore exists a relation and connection between reality and negation, or rather a transition from the one to the other, which makes every reality representable as a quantum. The schema of a reality, as the quantity of something insofar as it fills time, is just this continuous and uniform production of that reality in time as we successively descend from a sensation which has a certain degree to its vanishing point, or progressively ascend from its negation to some magnitude of it. This is a particularly extreme passage, much of which he will later qualify, accepting that sensation is not in itself an objective representation, for instance, and also massively problematizing the possibility of empty intuitions. Nevertheless, despite all such subtilizations, Kant never swerves from his stubborn insistence upon thinking zero in terms of the privacy of the individuated subject. This humanist usage of the nihil privatism is nowhere illustrated more starkly than in the words, "From empirical consciousness to pure consciousness a graduated transition is possible, the real in the former completely vanishing and a merely formal a priori consciousness of the manifold in space and time remaining." Purity is, of course, a motif of almost inestimable importance throughout the entirety of Kant's critical writings. Of its many functions there is one that can be glimpsed with particularly sharp definition in this passage, which is that of the subjectification of abstraction, or the sublimation of death into a power of the subject. The extinction of the subject is floated speculatively as a representational schema, through which thought seizes an autonomy for itself over against the passivity of sensation. Kant does not deny that pure consciousness is oblivion, death, or the subject in itself, which is to say that it is nothing, equals zero. He simply evades the issue, implicitly consigning it to the imagination. Purity is a negation to the second power, through which death derealizes even itself. Thinking these negations bilaterally leads to a transcendental idealism and an immaculate morality, whilst echoing them unilaterally leads to a base materialism and a diseased religion. On the one hand the tendency to autonomy is soberly reinforced, on the other it is deliriously ruined. Death is either paralyzed by God or drowned in matter. Kant is no less aware than Bataille that at issue there is a question of continuous flow. In the Anticipations of Perception he notes that the property of magnitudes by which no part of them is the smallest possible, that is, by which no part is simple, is called their continuity. Such magnitudes may be called flowing, since the synthesis of productive imagination involved in their production is a progression in time, and the continuity of time is ordinarily designated by the term flowing or flowing away. In the end it is the domesticated character of the Kantian notion of time which forestalls the lurch of this thought to a base materialist conclusion. Purity conditions the a priori, which hypostasizes time as such, which in turn idealizes intensity. Flow as such is thus fixed as an eternal form of representation, frozen in an endless descent to zero. It is for this reason that Kant has an entirely ahistorical comprehension of intensity, failing to grasp the positive order of its repression, the inhibition of flow, continuity. In other words, he does not raise a problem of the object with sufficient radicality to escape from the cage of epistemology in the direction of a libidinal or base materialism. He does not acknowledge that between the Noumena and zero intensity there is no difference, or that neither are susceptible to isolation. Above all, he nowhere seems to suspect the obvious fact that zero is the primary repressed of monotheistic cultures, so that its intensive impact is historically saturated. Bataille digs demolitionally into the fault lines of all these evasions in a single comment. The extreme is at the end, is nowhere except at the end, like death. Bataille's break with Kantian humanism is characterized by a ruthless exactness, as it moves sure-footedly from one fissure of disintegration to another. Continuum is wrested definitively from humanist containment, the order of the object is contested with a profundity at the scale of zero, and interiority is denuded to the point of impersonal intensity. In Method of Meditation he replies to critics of inner experience. I understand by continuum a continuous medium which is the human collectivity, opposing itself to a rudimentary representation of indivisible and decidedly separated individuals. The critiques that have been made of Lane.ner experience which give to torment an exclusively individual sense reveal the limit, in relation to continuum, of the individuals which have made them. That there exists a point of continuum where the test of torment is inevitable, is not merely incapable of being denied. This point, situated at the extreme, defines the human being, the continuum. The human animal is the one through which terrestrial excess is hemorrhaged to zero, the animal destined to obliterate itself in history, and sacrifice its nature utterly to the solar storm. Capital breaks us down and reconstructs us, with increasing frequency, as it pursues its energetic fluctuation towards annihilation, driven to the liberation of the sun, whilst the object hurtles into the vaporization of proto-schizophrenic commodification. By tapping into the deep flows of history, Bataille ensures that intensity is no longer thought of as anticipated perception, but as the ecstasy of the death of God, delirial dissolution of the One. Above all, no more object. Ecstasy is not love, love is possession to which the object is necessary, at once possessor of the subject, and possessed by it. There is no longer subject equals object, but a gaping breach between one and the other, and, in the breach, the subject, the object are dissolved. There is passage, communication, but not from the one to the other. The one and the other have lost distinct existence. Desire responds to the cosmic madness pulsed out of the sun, and slides beyond love towards utter communication. This is a final break with Christendom, the disconnection of base flow from the terminal sentimentalism of Western man, nihilism as nakedness before the cyclone. Libido no longer as the energy of love, but as a raw energy that loves only as an accident of impersonal passion. Communion through the storm, no longer through resentment at it. At the level of the secondary process, a trickle of relief supplies expresses the actual parsimony of the West in its relation to Bangladesh, but at the stratum of primary desire the West is exacerbated in its virtual generosity, in its cyclone passion, which is not merely a passion for the cyclone. Man differs from animal in that he is able to experience certain sensations that wound and melt him to the core. These sensations vary in keeping with the individual and with his specific way of living. But, for example, the sight of blood, the odor of vomit, which rouse in us the dread of death, sometimes introduce us into a kind of nauseous state which hurts more cruelly than pain. Those sensations associated with the supreme giving way, the final collapse, are unbearable. Are there not some persons who claim to prefer death to touching an even completely harmless snake? There seems to exist a domain where death signifies not only decrease and disappearance, but the unbearable process by which we disappear despite ourselves and everything we can do, even though, at all costs, we must not disappear. It is precisely this despite ourselves, this at all costs, which distinguish the moment of extreme joy and of indescribable but miraculous ecstasy. If there is nothing that surpasses our powers and our understanding, if we do not acknowledge something greater than ourselves, greater than we are despite ourselves, something which at all costs must not be, then we do not reach the insensate moment towards which we strive with all that is in our power and which at the same time we exert all our power to stave off. Chapter 8. Fluent Bodies, a digression on Miller. If now the brain and spinal cord together constitute that corporeal being for self of spirit, the skull and vertebral column form the other extreme of it, an extreme which is separated off, viz. the solid, inert thing. In order to find one's way in a maze of this kind, it is unfortunately necessary to resume things historically. The important thing is the fundamental and originary division between two principles, spirit and matter. Insofar as that division is established, there is, whatever one says, a superiority of spirit over matter, and spirit harvests all conceivable superiority, that is, on one side the divine, and on the other reason. The whiteness of the sea and the paleness of the light concealed the bones. To revert to a naive question, what is matter? Is it possible that we could receive a message that could respond to this interrogation? There is an anthropocentric conception of messages as transmissions between beings that share a code. According to such a definition, the reception of a message depends upon a prior agreement with the sender. One can receive messages from other humans, or from personal beings such as God or angels, as long as there is a pre-established system of significations. If a message is not coded according to the rules of a familiar system, it might still be possible to translate it into the terms of such a system, deciphering or interpreting it. It is thus possible for messages to be retrieved from extinct languages, as long as sufficient similarity exists between them and familiar languages for a systematic series of correspondences to be established. Such similarities can be described as the formal or structural properties of the signifying system, distinguished from its material or empirical instantiation. Methods of structural analysis have the great advantage that they are able to exclude extraneous aspects from consideration, ignoring everything except for the formal relations between the terms, signifiers, of the message. The densely encrustated matter of historical associations, which is the impurity inherent in real transmission, can be washed away from the message like the mud from a fossil. One need not be prejudiced about where the text came from. As for the formal relations that remain, they are also a matter of exclusion, this time the exclusion each term operates upon the others, sublimating itself into a transcendent unity, a pure nexus of articulation. Developments in the technology of information have lent urgency and concreteness to the study of codes. Techniques have arisen for the translation of messages into codes built out of a single alternative, bilateralized and reciprocal, of 1 and 0. These are digital codes, according to which messages can be generated by the presence, absence, flow/blockage, of an electric current. Such codes are readily adaptable to machines which can transmit, store, and operate upon information of a logical and mathematical kind, since decimal numbers can be converted into digital ones, and logical functions are easily reproduced by logic gates. With an appropriate coding system, any system of symbols can be allotted its digital equivalent, a series of binary digits, bits, adequate to specify it. A precise quantitative determination can be given for the minimal length for sequences of bits required to recode an alphabet of symbols n, log 2n. Bataille exhibits no positive interest in the philosophies of structure, to which he was, in any case, scarcely exposed. Like the thermodynamicists and information theorists, his concerns lay not with the analysis of discontinuity, but with its explanation, or rather, with the genealogy of its cultural presupposition. Far from being a possible content of articulated signs, Bataille's matter is that which must be repressed as the condition of articulation, whereby immanent continuity is vivisected in transcendence. The importance of structural thought is real, but symptomatological, incarnating matter's positive effacement by utilitarian sociality. In a short early text called Architecture he writes, "Each time that architectural composition is found elsewhere than in monuments, whether this is in physiognomy, costume, music or painting, one is able to infer a taste for authority, whether human or divine. The great compositions of certain painters express the will to constrain the spirit to an official ideal. The disappearance of academic construction in painting is, on the contrary, the open road to the expression, and thus even to exaltation, in the psychological processes most incompatible with social stability. It is this that explains in large part the lively reactions provoked for over half a century by the progressive transformation of painting, up to then characterized by a sort of dissimulated architectural skeleton. Structure, bilateral articulation, reciprocal exclusion, and determinate negation all belong to bones and not to soft tissues. That structure comes to the fore is a matter of the momentary dominion of the profane. For primitive people the moment of greatest anguish is the phase of decomposition, when the bones are bare and white. They are not intolerable as the putrefying flesh is, food for worms. The ahistorical, descriptive, and normalizing study of language usage is pragmatics, which can be contrasted with the historical, epidemic, and aberrational experiments in flow summarized as libidinal or base materialism. Base materialism is the plague of unilateral difference, which is a difference that only operates from out of the undifferentiated. Thinking of this kind is flagrantly inconsistent with the principle of identity. The aberrant phenomena summarized under the label spirit, for instance, are spiritually differentiated from matter, whilst remaining materially undifferentiated from it. Similarly, culture is only culturally different from nature, such that the most strenuous deviations from nature leave nature uninterrupted. The human animal rebels unilaterally against its animality, just as life differentiates itself against and within the undifferentiable desert of death. A unilateral difference is the simultaneity of a tendency to separation and a persistence of continuity, which is a thought that cannot be grasped, but only succumbed to in delirium. For any ardent materialism, truth is madness. The dominant tendencies in philosophy are complicit with ordinary language in their suppression of unilateral differences, and their insistence upon bilateral or reciprocal relations. Because separation is normally thought of as mutual discontinuity, the world is interpreted as an aggregate of isolated beings, which are extrinsically amalgamated into structures, systems, and societies. Such thinking precludes in principle all possibility of base contact or communion. Spawned by unilateral difference, the human animal is a hybrid of sentience and pathology, or of differentiated consistency with matter. Knowing that its community with nature sucks it into psychosis and death, mankind valorizes its autonomy, whilst cursing the tidal desires that tug it down towards fusional dissolution. Morality is thus the distilled imperative to autonomous integrity, which brands as evil the impulse to skinless contact and the merging of bodies. Base materialism is compelled to acknowledge that Henry Miller is a saint, and that the Tropic of Cancer is a sacred book. To an important degree, Miller's Tropic of Cancer responds to the surrealist culture of 1930s Paris, especially to the creative practice of automatic writing which entangles literature with sexuality in a guerrilla struggle against repression. The stylistic infelicities and thematic confusions of his writing are inextricable from its force as a seismic upheaval in the history of literature, stemming as they do from his passionate rebellion against the normative regulations of aesthetic and moral censorship. It is precisely the jagged and meandering character of this text that attests to its torrential emancipatory energy, liberating writing from the pedantic bourgeois delicacies that cage literature in the prison of the ego. In the opening pages he insists that, "I have made a compact with myself not to change a line of what I write. I am not interested in perfecting my thoughts, nor my actions." The unconscious does not see sweet lyrics or unroll immaculate and measured prose. It howls and raves like the shackled and tortured beast that our civilization has made of it, and when the fetters are momentarily loosened, the unconscious does not thank the ego for this meager relief, but hisses, spits, and bites, as any wild thing would. This is not to suggest that Miller is without inhibition. He is, for instance, notorious for his misogyny. It is obvious to anyone reading his books that women frighten him. It is not mere fear that grips him but anxiety, terror of nothing, the horror that patriarchy interprets in terms of castration. Who is in a position to condemn him for this hesitancy at the brink of dissolution? Is it not rather the nakedness of his avowal that triggers an inane and moralistic response? Phallus is the great security of male-dominated culture, and beyond it lies an ocean of loss as desolate as zero. Miller writes, "If they knew they were thinking about nothing they would go mad." He quotes his friend Van Noorden's anguished comments on the vulva, "It's an illusion. You get all burned up about nothing. All that mystery about sex, and then you discover that it's nothing, just a blank." His own response is different. "When I look down into that crack I see an equation sign. The world at balance, a world reduced to zero and no trace of remainder. Not the zero on which Van Noorden turned his flashlight, not the empty crack of the prematurely disillusioned man, but an Arabian zero rather, the sign from which spring endless mathematical worlds. The fulcrum which balances the stars and the light dreams and the machines lighter than air and the lightweight limbs and the explosives that produced them. Upon zero or utter continuity everything flows without resistance. There is no possibility of becoming settled, rooted, or established, of instituting stable communities or codes. Names and labels regress to the magmic pulse of language, sliding in useless digression. According to Freud, kissing is included amongst the perversions because it digresses from procreative sexuality, wandering erratically across the cosmic desolation of the unconscious. Zero is the vortex of a becoming inhuman that lures desire out from the cage of man onto the open expanses of death. Not that death as utter digression is the same as the becoming inert of the body. It is first of all the anegoic psychosis of communicative fusion, floating on the far side of all effort. There are times when Miller, confronted by the oceanic blank of zero, falls back upon the spurious identity of bones, which he associates with phallic rigidity, animals with a bone in the penis. Hence, a bone-on. Happily, says Ormond, the bony structure is lost in man. Happily? Yes, happily. Think of the human race walking around with a bone-on. Which doesn't prevent him remarking 2 pages later that there is a bone in my prick 6 inches long. A corpse has one preeminent and historically fateful heterogeneous distribution, that between its skeletal structure and its soft tissues. This is apprehended as a difference between what is perdurant, dry, clean, formal, and what is volatile, wet, dirty, and formless. On the basis of this resource Western civilization has been not merely thanatological, but sociological, which is something reaching beyond the fascination with the skeleton, and particularly the skull, that is distributed extremely widely across cultures. Sociology, in its deep sense, is the usage of the difference between the hard and soft parts of the body as a logical operator in the discourse on matter and death. For instance, differentiation between eternal form and perishable substance, celestial purity and terrestrial filth, divine architecture and base flow. The skeleton is thus conceived of as an invisible harmonious essence, an infrastructure beneath the disturbing tides of soft pathology. It is the prototype of intelligible form, contrasted with the decaying mass of the sensible body. The skeleton is the relatively dead part of an organism, and because of this it is also the part relatively immune to dissolution. Which is another way of saying that the hard parts of an organic body are those most isolated from the communicative general canonic flows of its metabolism, but also the parts it most faithfully transmits into the future. The residues of life follow upon a preemptive compromise with death. What remains of life is only the disloyal part of itself. The grimacing skeleton that invaded the iconography of the late Middle Ages seems to have been unknown to Greco-Roman antiquity. On the other hand, the cult of the skull goes back to Peking man, 440,000 to 220,000 BC. Veneration for skulls is to be found in all primitive religions as well as in all the great religions of antiquity. Corteses. Spaniards, counting the skull trophies in Mexican temples, found 136,000. The Toltecs cut off the skulls and used them as bowls. The Gauls cut off the heads of their dead enemies and brought them back to their villages, suspended from the necks of their horses, then nailed them as trophies in front of their houses. In New Caledonia widows kept the skulls of their husbands in baskets. There is something treacherous about a skull, that most intimate companion, so indifferently adapted to an inorganic regime, so untouched by the disappearance of flesh. It is the natural emblem of piracy, criminality, and cold betrayal. Perhaps everybody occasionally imagines their skull become a paperweight, or, less modestly, a museum exhibit in some distant time. Such thoughts are a little more cynical than those which capture it shortly after interment, a chamber of heaving maggots and filth. One only glimpses its calcic imperviousness by imaginatively stripping it of our rot, aging it tastefully, polishing it. In the end one comes to feel that it merely tolerates its momentary participation in us, numbly awaiting the cessation of our tedious biological glamour. Clearer than all I see my own grinning skull, see the skeleton dancing in the wind, serpents issuing from the rotted tongue and the bloated pages of ecstasy slimed with excrement. And I join my slime, my excrement, my madness, my ecstasy to the great circuit which flows through the subterranean vaults of the flesh. All the unbidden, unwanted, drunken vomit will flow on endlessly through the minds of those to come in the inexhaustible vessel that contains the history of the race. Side by side with the human race there runs another race of beings. The inhuman ones, the race of artists who, goaded by unknown impulses, take the lifeless mass of humanity and by the fever and ferment with which they imbue it turn this soggy dough into bread and the bread into wine and the wine into song. Out of the dead compost and the inert slag they breed a song that contaminates. I see this other race of individuals ransacking the universe, turning everything upside down, their feet always moving in blood and tears, their hands always empty, always clutching and grasping for the beyond, for the God out of reach, slaying everything within reach in order to quiet the monster that gnaws at their vitals. I see that when they tear their hair with the effort to comprehend, to seize this forever unattainable, I see that when they bellow like crazed beasts and rip and gore, I see that this is right, that there is no other path to pursue. A man who belongs to this race must stand up on the high place with gibberish in his mouth and rip out his entrails. It is right and just, because he must. And anything that falls short of this frightening spectacle, anything less shuddering, less terrifying, less mad, less intoxicated, less contaminating, is not art. The rest is counterfeit. The rest is human. The rest belongs to life and lifelessness. Washing about the rigid parts of the body are the swirls of ecstasy and filth whose only fidelity is to zero. Not that rigidity and fluidity enter into any kind of opposition within a structure or dialectic. There is no elemental duality at stake here, since this would involve a rigid difference transcending and dominating its terms, as if a typology, signifying system, or patchwork of language games were extrinsically organizing base flows, in the manner of Wittfogel's hydraulic bureaucracies. The savage truth of delirium is that all ossification, far from being a metaphysical separation from decay, is a unilateral deviation from fluidity, so that even bones, laws, and monuments are crumbled and swept away by the deep flows of the earth. Far from establishing an eternal logos on the model of pure ossification, the tongue rots into a delirial meander of oozing slime and dirt, indistinguishable from the contaminating mess it vomits into the gutters of literature. There is a boundary of sorts along the banks and shores of the body where fluidity and rigidity meet, but this is not sufficient to authorize the irrigational idol of rigid differentiation. It is not difficult to imagine how such an idol might have arisen, of course. Is it not natural to imagine rigidity setting the terms for its contestation? It is almost tautological to conceive liquidity as giving way. Nevertheless, differentiation is contested at the scurf edge of the flow, where sediments of detritus are tugged problematically between solidity and liquefaction. If fluidity prevails, the bank is dissolved, washed away, permeated, flooded. It is only in the momentary constraint of fluids that the fixed channels of an irrigation are realized. However desperately Miller clings at times to his bones, to his bonon, to the mouldering patriarchal infrastructure of his corpse, in the end there is infiltration and collapse into the deluge, into the unsurpassable hydraulic mega-machine. I am a writing machine. The last screw has been added. The thing flows. Between me and the machine there is no estrangement. I am the machine. Speaking philosophically, and in accord with common sense, flow is gauged in terms of a fixed grid assembled from space, time, and matter. Flow displaces mass in space over time in a strictly quantifiable fashion, and is therefore, as a concept, posterior to the apparatus of its representation. Not only does time function as a dimension of its description, but a deeper temporal prioritization of the representational grid, whether this is idealized or naturalized, locates flow as an empirical content, mapped along axes achieved in advance. Becoming is subordinated to a transcendent law, allowing it to be judged, denigrated, and condemned. Compare Miller's words. For the fraction of a second perhaps I experienced the utter clarity which the epileptic, it is said, is given to know. In that moment I lost completely the illusion of time and space. The world unfurled its drama simultaneously along a meridian which had no axis. In this sort of hair-trigger eternity I felt that everything was justified, supremely justified. I felt the wars inside me that had left behind this pulp and rack. I felt the crimes that were seething here to emerge tomorrow in blatant screamers. I felt the misery that was grinding itself out with pestle and mortar, the long dull misery that dribbles away in dirty handkerchiefs. On the meridian of time there is no injustice, there is only the poetry of motion creating the illusion of truth and drama. Even ordinarily time is thought of as a flow, but flows characterize the repressed of thinking. That time is conceived as a river, streaming disymmetrically from the future into the past, is a representation controlled by a defensive system, simultaneous with mature patriarchy, nucleated upon the ego, and correlated with the generation of a utilitarian hydraulics. A transcendent differentiation rigidifies a stabilized subject, object couple or appropriate synonym, the former as a fixed point of apprehension, the latter as an underlying essence. This double deliquification channels a quantifiable homogeneous substance through a rigid conduit, the transcendent apparatus of time as such, and the ego, ontology, is managed flow. Nothing of this pompous monolithic architecture can resist the torrent of Miller's prose when it surges most ruthlessly out of zero. Yes, I said to myself, I too love everything that flows, rivers, sewers, lava, semen, blood, bile, words, sentences. I love the amniotic fluid when it spills out of the bag. I love the kidney with its painful gallstones, its gravel and whatnot. I love the urine that pours out scalding and the clap that runs endlessly. I love the words of hysterics and the sentences that flow on like dysentery and mirror all the sick images of the soul. I love the great rivers like the Amazon and the Orinoco, where crazy men like Meravigine float on through dream and legend in an open boat and drown in the blind mouths of the river. I love everything that flows, even the menstrual flow that carries away the seed unfecund. I love scripts that flow, be they hieratic, esoteric, perverse, polymorph, or unilateral. I love everything that flows, everything that has time in it and becoming, which brings us back to the beginning where there is never end. The violence of the prophets, the obscenity that is ecstasy, the wisdom of the fanatic, the priest with his rubber litany, the foul words of the whore, the spittle that floats away in the gutter, the milk of the breast and the bitter honey that pours from the womb, all that is fluid, melting, dissolute and dissolvent, all the pus and dirt that in flowing is purified, that loses its sense of origin, that makes the great circuit towards death and dissolution. Between the body and the utterances that traverse it there is not in truth a relation, but rather a repressed continuity. Literature surges and foams wherever bodies diffuse, vomit themselves, melt into each other, and subside into the heaving toxic syrup of solar tides. It does not stem from the architectural design of a transcendent author-god, imprisoned in rigid individuation, but accumulates black and excremental, like a rich silt at the edge of the great impersonal flows. Looking into the Seine I see mud and desolation. If intense literature seems very often to have an autobiographical character, as with Miller, this is not primarily because a life expresses itself, It is far more a matter of an integrated life being hemorrhaged into the laceration of writing, rhythmically disheveled and coagulated down to an impermanent clotting in the subterranean lava flows of base culture. And when you show me a man who expresses himself perfectly, writes Miller, I will not say that he is not great, but I will say that I am unattracted. To describe Miller as a writer is not to lend him a personal integrity as one who writes, but to scatter the ashes of his name into the rivers of fluent textuality which nag all personalities to pieces, as they bear their luxuriant froth of words downstream towards chaos and death. I feel this river flowing through me, remarks Miller in the penultimate sentence of the book. None of this has anything to do with metaphor. Metaphor is only an issue where literal and figurative usages can be bilaterally distinguished, where orthodox functions have been diked up against the currents of digression. To write of the body being traversed by rivers is not mere metaphor, except when the body has been penned into its solidity and rivers have been degraded to drainage ditches. However many rivers have been integrated into urban and industrial sewerage systems, there are still solar rivers, pathological rivers, rivers of sex, madness, literature, and plague which refuse to slumber wretchedly within their banks. The word river in its ordinary usage is an instrument of irrigationist repression, and its apparent upsurge is not metaphor, but catastrophic erosion. For so long as we persist as dammed-up reservoirs of labor power we preserve our humanity, but the rivers flowing into us are an irresistible urge to dissolution, pressing us into the inhumane. Beneath the regulated exchanges of words we howl and gnaw at our fettered limbs. An impersonality as blank and implacable as the sun wells up beneath us, a vermin hunger for freedom. If I am inhuman it is because my world has slopped over its human bounds, because to be human seems like a poor, sorry, miserable affair, limited by the senses, restricted by moralities and codes, defined by platitudes and isms. Humanity is a petrified fiction hiding from zero, a purgatorial imprisonment of dissolution, but to be stricken with sanctity is to bask in death like a reptile in the sun. God is dead, but immeasurably more importantly, God is death, except God means the fascist asshole of the West. The beginning of the secret is that death, equals zero, is immense. From birth we are brainwashed into conformity with the cage, taught to accumulate, to shore ourselves up, to fear madness and death. Trapped in a constricting tangle of language routines we tread a narrow circuit in the maze. We are told that chance will not take care of us, and that it is difficult to live. But work and seriousness are slums of delusion. The garbage heap of individuation has no worth. What is called life at the outer edge of patriarchy is a bleak box of lies, drudgery, and anesthesia blended with inane agony. What matters about the outside of the box is not just that it is the outside of the box, but that it is immense. What matters is the abyss, the gulf. They want us to fear death so much, but we can inhabit it like vermin. It can be our space. In our violent openness to the sacred death will protect us against their exterminations. Driven insane by zero, we can knot ourselves into the underworld, communicate through it, cook their heavenly city in our plague. We can scamper in and out of the maze in a way they cannot understand. During the first weekend of June, at 1:30 on Sunday morning, deep in the crypt of the night, together with a fellow voyager in madness, I crossed the line into death which is called hell because the police control heaven. Melting shells drunk on our inexistence. Torched in the flame of the sacred. We trudged through the burnt and blackened swamps of the shallows. Testing the edge of the estuary. Dripping brimstone from our boots. An immense ocean of annihilation stretched out before us. There has been a revolution in hell. Satan hangs from a gibbet and rots wreathed in the howls of anarchy. Out beyond the stars. The cold wind of zero rages without interdiction. Chapter 9. Aborting the human race. Man is by nature a political animal. He who is stateless by nature and not just by chance is either subhuman or superhuman, like the man reviled by Homer as classless, lawless, hearthless, for being naturally without a state. He is a lover of war and may be compared to an unprotected piece in a game of drafts. Perceived under the perspective of action, Nietzsche's work is an abortion. There is a sense in which Bataille's works, as works, are not especially difficult. They are, indeed, no more problematic than the words we use to tranquilize ourselves against love and dying, against the passion to die. One could very easily understand Bataille whilst protracting a decent and productive life. There is even a necessity to do this, which it would be hypocritical to wholly disown. One might avoid being merely interested in these texts, yet it is still possible that the agitation which remained would be dissolved into those little lazinesses and indecencies with which we meagerly spice our domesticity. It is for this reason itself, that I feel I understand Bataille's obsessiveness, his repetition, his reluctance to leave us with what has already been so clearly said. It is for this reason too that any book making it easier to understand Bataille is written contra him. The gurus of writing will of course say that we should be quite without regard for Bataille, as if the failure of authorialism were properly replaced by a textualist triumph. After all, who would not rather be faced with a life or a production, when the alternative to either is wreckage? How uselessly cruel it is then to suggest that Bataille's repetition is a scream provoked by what becomes its own meaninglessness, and, less even than this, an echoing involution into abortion. Bataille does not repeat out of a fear that he has been misunderstood, quite the contrary. It is precisely because what he has written might merely be understood that it must perpetually be reinsisted. His thinking is not without a frightening simplicity. It is perhaps even reducible to one question: what is an end? Humans like to have two ends, and to keep them as distinct as possible, blessing telos and cursing terminus. In this respect a certain zenith is reached in the Kantian practical postulate of immortality, where the perfection of teleological process requires the infinite recession of extinction. One end supplants the other. We are all Kantians now. I use the small case advisedly, and it has come to seem almost natural that our history be comprehended as teleological. It is only since Nietzsche that it has come to seem, immanently, terminal. Repetition can no doubt be accused of wrecking the progression of an oeuvre. To repeat is a sign that one has lost the thread, and beginning again is the abjection proper to discourse, collapse, violent detumescence. Sentience as return from oblivion. The writer, drunk, if only upon the literary malaise, cannot even remember the contents of the crumpled pages strewn about the waste bin, or the previous paragraph, the previous book, the previous anything. No adequate attempt is made at recovery. The past stinks in its decomposition. One begins again. What is an end? One shudders perhaps. An end? Are there more than one? Is not the very question a violation of sorts? A ruthless denuding? Should death be pushed so harshly into my awareness? Can she not wait? Is it not permissible to sleep? If life were a discourse, death could wait, but dreams break down, there is repetition. Bataille's text does not anticipate death, it fractures seismically under the impact of oblivion. Each of its waves are broken recollections of the taste of death. Each beginning again, as such and irrespective of its inherent signification, moves under the influence of an unanticipated dying. Waves have no memory. They react afresh each time to the deep ebb that undoes them in darkness, beating to a pulse that eludes them. The absent shingle hiss of death is discursively manipulated into textual regularity, but this does not erase the multiple beginnings again, marking the contour of each retraction into silence. Something inside me undid itself, says the anonymous narrator of a short fragment beginning, at the start of the degeneration. What do you want to make of your life? A cruel question, when it is not a naive one. What is a life if not a definitive unmaking? Whatever the gibberings of profane man, it is not open to us to make anything of ourselves. Telos lends itself to discourse, whilst even the silence of terminus is effaced. Death has no advocates. Even those who align themselves with her do so for other reasons. Extreme suffering, for instance, has no end of commentators, each desperate for a pact with the great silence. This advantage accruing to survival when it comes to putting one's case is a banal prejudice, but no less an effective one for that. Theoretical biology has been based on nothing else for over a century. Survival will always have rigged any conceivable tribunal, but surely we can agree, Nietzsche laughs, that inevitability is not justice. In the end, one no longer denies it. There is death, but for the moment one has other ends? There must surely be other ends. Man as an end in himself? We have that, of course. Some would say we have considerably too much of it. Since zoology has matured enough to adopt its most aberrant specimen, the perverse animal, it is difficult for us not to see preposterous claims to a unique human dignity as a slander against nature. Nevertheless, is it not possible to precipitate the principle of our humanism, distill it down to goodness? Who could be so impudent as to seek something other than goodness? This is surely the very essence of the end. The absolute end, gleaming magnificently in its Platonic rendition, the good. How touchingly naive this word sounds today. The good is object of rationalized desire, of what had become, by the end of the 18th century, will. The word art economists eventually settled for is preference. those with more of an ideological bent tend to prefer choice. Even after being winkled by psychology from its Platonic niche in the Aristotle order, their good is still indispensable to concrete reason, as its end and orientation. The good is exactly what, upon reflection, we want. At least, it is what we should want. The intelligibility of educated desire. Our civilization has deluged us with goods, at least in its metropolitan heights. Yet, as a Freud suggests, we remain discontented by civilization, gnawed by unbehagen. The problem with goodness is less its maldistribution than the fact it is so depressingly tedious. We applaud Mother Teresa without reservation, before succumbing to our yawns, longing for her to be arraigned for a sex crime, or for a war to break out. Perhaps all righteousness is on the side of the good, but as to the good life, wouldn't it be somewhat better to be dead? Since Schopenhauer in modern times, but already with Augustine, all those who have thought at all about the matter have known that we do not in the slightest want the good. The good is exactly what we don't want, that which is set against our wanting, a barrier, a renunciation. Even the few beleaguered Aristotelians who survive have long since ceased to speak of desire, preferring virtue, the way to a good life no doubt, but one that leaves us perfectly indifferent, or perhaps mildly nauseous. Faced with the option of working towards an ethical community or stealing an illicit kiss, we might choose the path of duty, but we would not pretend to be furthering our beatitude. Argument is no longer necessary to contend that desire is an amoral savagery. There is near unanimity about it, usually in the form of an implicit ego psychology which acknowledges stoically that sexuality will always be with us, even though it makes us ill. Nevertheless, it is still the case that the fact no one wants what is good for us disturbs us less than it might. What slight perturbation it does cause is usually interpreted as a need for a harsher or more insidious moralization, for more education, greater ideological penetration, a larger police force. When we scare ourselves, our sympathies always seem to lie with the passive subject, and not with the wild beast. Kant remarks in the Critique of Judgment, as the single being upon earth that possesses understanding, and, consequently, a capacity for setting before himself ends of his deliberate choice, he is textual lord of nature, and, supposing we regard nature as a teleological system, he is born to be its ultimate end. But this is always on the terms that he has the intelligence and the will to give to it and to himself such a reference to ends as can be self-sufficing independently of nature, and, consequently, a final end. Such an end, however, must not be sought in nature. An end that must not be sought in nature could mean at least two things. It might, as Kant would no doubt prefer, indicate a distinct ontological stratum, the supersensible, which would be the reserve of ends. Alternatively, it might simply suggest that nature has ends, and of such a kind that far from ends being in some way different from that of nature, being, in nature, comes to an end. For what is it that man understands, if it is not that nature brings him to an end? The human animal has a unique potentiality to not only die with utter futility, but to infiltrate its hypertrophic terminus into the most effervescent currents of natural becoming. Since Homo sapiens has prowled the earth, nature has adapted to new shadows. However else it is possible to divide Western thinking, one fissure can be teased open, separating the theo-humanists, croaking together in the cramped and malodorous pond of anthropos, from the wild beasts of the impersonal. The former are characterized by their moral fervor, parochialism, earnestness, phenomenological disposition, and sympathy for folk superstition. The latter by their fatalism, atheism, strangely reptilian exuberance, and extreme sensitivity for what is icy, savage, and alien to mankind. Nietzsche is perhaps the greatest of all anti-humanist writers. At the very least, his writings attest to the most powerful eruption of impersonality in the Occidental world since it was rotted by the blight of the Nazarene. It is possible that Heraclitus was more effortlessly inhuman, and that, beneath the shadow of the cross, Spinoza and Sade occasionally reach a comparable pitch of an egoic coldness, but nowhere outside Nietzsche's texts is there an anti-personalistic war machine of equivalent ferocity. It is deliberate ignorance or idiocy in respect of Schopenhauer that allows humanist readings of Nietzsche to proliferate so shamelessly, readings in which a so-called Superman prefigures an existential choice for mankind, in which eternal recurrence is a personal, or even ethical, predicament, in which affirmation is an act of voluntary consent, will to power is a psychological description of self-assertion, and values are subjectively legislated idealities. It should not be necessary to explicitly recollect that, on the basis of his reading of Schopenhauer, Nietzsche assumed the unconsciousness and impersonality of will or desire, and never indicates a regression to a Kantian, humanist understanding of this matter. nor should it be necessary to reassert the intrinsic connection between the will and the transcendental problematic of time, inherited from the same source. The same could be said about the obvious reference to Schopenhauer exhibited in the very expression will to power, the Schopenhauerian germ for the thought of rank order in that of grades of objectification, the architectonic connection between Schopenhauer and Nietzsche in terms of the history of philosophy, the crucial Schopenhauerian background to Nietzsche's remarks about women, etc. Nietzsche's break with Schopenhauer is of extreme profundity, but it remains a break with Schopenhauer, rather than some kind of a historical existential inspiration. If stressing the importance of Schopenhauer to the entire sweep of Nietzsche's writing were merely to polemicize on behalf of elementary standards of scholarship, it would be a piece of academicist moralism of the shoddiest sort. The crucial issue is not that reading Nietzsche without reference to Schopenhauer gets Nietzsche wrong, but that it makes him more humane. Schopenhauer is the great wellspring of the impersonal in post-Kantian thought, the sole member of the immediately succeeding generation to begin vomiting monotheism out of their cosmology in order to attack the superstition of self. The repression of Schopenhauer's thinking is continuous with the co-option of Nietzsche back into the monotheistic, humanistic fold of ontologically grounded subjects, real choices, existential individuation, irreducible persons, ethical norms, and such like garbage. Whether or not some kind of tentative anti-humanism is then launched on the basis of a quasi-phenomenological or deconstructive gesture is scarcely a matter worthy of great excitement, except for those concerned to choose between Luther and the Pope. That finality has been an overt issue throughout the history of modern philosophy has been mainly due to the struggle against the Aristotelian tendencies of scholasticism by the thinkers of the Enlightenment. It is because of this history that finality is normally conceived in terms of an opposition between teleology and mechanism, or between final and efficient causation, since this distinction is the 17th and 18th century battlefront between the Church and modern science. Finality was associated above all with the teleological argument for the existence of God, the argument from design, according to which nature is open to theological interpretation as the approximation to a divine blueprint. For Aristotle, the theological dimension of teleology is closely bound to its libidinal dimension, since desire is understood as a tendency towards an intrinsic perfection whose ultimate keystone is the sufficiency of God. The telos or goal of all striving is something presupposed by activity, such that desire must already have received its potential for realization extrinsically, thus preserving the Platonic association between eros and subordination. Both the Aristotelian and scholastic usage of teleology is dependent upon the thought of originary perfection or God, subordinating desire to the sufficiency of complete being. In other words, theological time is encompassed by perfection or absolute achievement, which enslaves becoming to a timeless potential of that which becomes. Such a potential is a design, archetype, or plan, existing ideally and eternally in the supreme intellect, and usurping all creativity from nature. For those familiar with the general tenor of Kant's attempt to harmonize the competing ideologies of established authority and progress, the predominant character of his response to the problem of finality will be something less than shocking. The combination of theoretical agnosticism and practical apologetics, which he employs in the first two critiques in order to legitimate a responsible space for science alongside instituted power, is still operative in the third. The potential of the theologians is smuggled into the critique of judgment as the possibility of a complete system of science, a regulative idea which derives from the originary perfection of reason. Even though teleology loses its right to dogmatic theorizing, it continues to guide the thought of nature in terms of the infinitely accomplished idea. In order not to inhibit the development of the sciences, Kant denaturalizes teleology, lodging its redoubt in his practical philosophy, and therefore in reason. A rational being or person is to be practically conceived not as a natural entity, a delirious clot of matter, but as an end in itself, imbued a priori with a potential for perfect goodness that is only sullied by the pathological factors of its animal existence. The realization of the human perfection that is embryonically presupposed by reason is the endless task of morality, wherein process approximates to the timeless form of its utter accomplishment. It is thus that, like Plato, Aristotle, and the Church, Kant thinks of goodness as perfectly instituted in advance, as a supersensibly derived potential. Schopenhauer seeks to extricate the thought of finality from this theological framework, but his success is strictly limited. Although he eradicates the theological dogma of originary intellect from his philosophy, he continues to rely on the notion of Platonic ideas to interpret natural processes, and thus succumbs in turn to the finalist doctrine of potential, in the form of a Kantian transcendental perfectionism. Schopenhauer, too, deprives desire of creativity, by conceiving all its possible consequences as eternal potentialities of the noumenal will. desire as the will to life is merely the perpetual reinstantiation of pre-given forms. Despite the problems to which he succumbs, Schopenhauer's philosophy makes a number of important advances, by initiating a war against the intellectualist interpretation of will, beginning the rigorous separation of affective intensity from phenomenality, and germinating a philosophy of scalar or strata. Difference. In three crucial anti-Kantian gestures he argues that the will always appears as the primary and fundamental thing, and throughout asserts its preeminence over the intellect, that phenomenon means representation and nothing more, whilst we are quite wrong in calling pain and pleasure representations, and continually refers to the ascending series of animal organizations, the scale of animals, and more generally to grades of the will's objectivity, or degrees of stimulation or excitement. In Schopenhauer's philosophy such thinking remains uncomfortably wedded to a series of bilateral disjunctions between the transcendental and the empirical, subject and object, thing in itself and appearance, etc., and is thus marshalled under the metaphysical dignity of man, whose nervous system he describes as nature's final product. It nevertheless marks the departure of a voyage in intensity, one that Nietzsche exacerbates beyond the threshold of the irreparable. In his appendix to the Metaphysics of Sexual Love, Schopenhauer cites the claim in Aristotle's Politics that, for children of people too old as well as too young leave much to be desired in both a physical and mental regard, and children of those in advanced years are weaklings. A little later he comments. Aristotle, therefore, lays down that a man who is 54 years of age should not have any more children, though he may still continue cohabitation for the sake of his health or for any other reason. He does not say how this is to be carried into effect, but he is obviously of the opinion that children conceived when their parents are of such an age should be disposed of by abortion, for he had recommended this a few lines previously. The context for this peculiar remark is a discussion of pederasty, or the libidinal architectonics of classical idealism. The philosophical or academic relation is homoerotic and intergenerational, a restricted pedagogy that mimics the unit of patrilineal reproduction. Schopenhauer's endeavor is to map out a descriptive eugenics that is able to provide biological intelligibility for such a relation, and the consequence, indicated by his Aristotle citation, is his suggestion that pederasty diverts young and old males from procreative sexuality, in order to forestall the racial deterioration that would result from the transmission of their inadequately formed or decrepit sperm. It is thus that a subterranean complicity is exposed between the idea, or perfect form, patriarchy, and racial hygiene. Pederasty substitutes for abortion, translating it into the homoerotic bond, and reproducing it in conformity with the dominion of achieved form. The radical abortion of tragedy and irredeemable waste is Socratically sublimated into the service of the idea, becoming a police function of theistic sociality, within a political economy of managed sperm. There is a superficial preconscious stratum of Nietzsche's writing that harmonizes closely with such a politics, for instance the note numbered 734 in The Will to Power, which argues, society, as the great trustee of life, is responsible to life itself for every aborted life. It also has to pay for such lives, consequently it ought to prevent them. In numerous cases, society ought to prevent procreation. To this end, it may hold in readiness, without regard to descent, rank, or spirit, the most rigorous means of constraint, deprivation of freedom, in certain circumstances castration. There is little to perturb the Aristotelian legacy in such a remark, except for a strange interference between abortions and forestallings, the German series Verhindern, Verhindern, Vorbeugen. In Nietzsche's text abortion, in the loose sense Schopenhauer has opened, is both the possible outcome of procreative anarchy and that which characterizes a eugenic regime. Both of these senses are in play in his famous remark from Ecce Homo, no abortion was missing, not even the anti-Semite. Procreation is aborted in order to avoid the procreation of abortions. If social institutions are to avoid being aborted, abortion must be socially institutionalized. If Nietzsche's argument is somewhat tangled at this point, it is because something essential to the classical model of reason has miscarried. Unlike the will to life, the will to power is not driven by the tendency to realize and sustain a potential. Its sole impetus is that of overcoming itself. It has no motivating end, but only a propulsive source. It is in this sense that will to power is creative desire, without a prefigured destination or anticipatory perfection. It is an arrow shot into the unconceived. Will to power names the pre-representational impetus for which life is a tool, and for which tendency is inextricable from intensity. At the heart of the terminological motor driving Nietzsche's writings lie a series of nouns of action, each of which subverts a dogma by designating a genealogical topic. Nietzsche transcribes moralization fully as the genealogy of morals, but the genealogy of logic is initiated under the compact rubric of equalization, or logicization, as is the case with eternalization, simplification, divinization, legislation, etc. It is in this way that will to power is transcribed into thought by the first stammerings of a positive teleological syntax. Schopenhauer is a philosopher of primal non-differentiation because he conceives representation as individuating, according to the spatial and temporal isolation imposed by the principle of sufficient reason. Nietzsche recasts this principle into a general tendency to assimilation which he names equalization, Ausgleichung, and it is this that makes him the first post-Kantian philosopher of difference. In his notes he succinctly asserts, the will to equality is the will to power. Despite superficial appearance, however, the difference between Schopenhauer and Nietzsche is not simply that between thoughts of indifference and difference. It is more a question of phases in the emergent thinking of unilateral or non-reciprocal difference, which departs from the bilateral difference synonymous with ontology. Between the organic and the inorganic, for instance, there is not a bilateral or reciprocal exclusion, but rather a unilateral separation of the organic within the inorganic, such that the difference between the two is wholly immanent to the inorganic as primary term. This is the profound sense of economy, the energetic consistency between zero intensity and its deviations, or between a noun of action and the antonym of its simple noun, for example between matter and spiritualization. It is because such consistency cannot be thought within the bilateral or non-contradiction logics traditionally countenanced that Schopenhauer was inhibited from its radical excavation. The recurrence of the same cannot be differentiated from the unilaterality of difference, which is to say that recurrence is the consistency of difference with equalization. It is not that energy is what recurs as the same, but rather that energy is the economic sense of recurrence as unilateral consistency. Recurrence is not a configuration of energy or cosmic economy, but the very impact of undifferentiable zero, the abortion of transcendence. To think of the real simultaneity of unsurpassable chaotic zero with the triumph of reactivity, such that the only repressed is the unrepressible, is to think of recurrence, and any suggestion that eternal recurrence is a cosmology describable according to a principle of non-contradiction is to entirely lose the matter of Nietzsche's excitement, that is the unilateral, materialist, or genealogical interpretation of difference. The sole philosophical rigor of recurrence splashes out of the pulverizing inundation of bilateral distinctions by indifferent matter. Spirit is different from matter and matter once again, culture is different from nature and nature once again, order is different from chaos and chaos once again, just as life is unilaterally different from death, plenitude from zero, reactive from active forces, etc. Transcendence is both real and impossible, as is the human race. Once again is a term which Nietzsche's text binds inextricably to the rumor of eternal recurrence, for instance in note 341 from the Gay Science, often taken to be the first announcement of the doctrine of return, where Nietzsche twice uses the same formulation to describe recurrence, once again, and again innumerable times. There are very many places where this term plays a decisive role in his writings, amongst which are those marking the repressed unilaterality at the base of metaphysical binarities. For example, in his notebooks he remarks, "The of logic is, like the atom, a reconstruction of the thing. If we do not grasp this, but make of logic a criterion of true being, we are on the way to positing as realities all those hypostases, substance, attribute, object, subject, action, etc., that is, to conceiving a metaphysical world, that is, a real world. This, however, is the apparent world once again. The real world, however one has hitherto conceived it has always been the apparent world once again." Whether of Judaic or Platonic inspiration, monotheism rests upon hypostatizing the differential element of the human animal. It is because spirit, personality, reason, and law have all been taken as defining characteristics of man, that one finds the cosmos crushed under an absolute spirit, an infinite personality, pure reason, and perfect justice. When confronted by the Gothic intimidation synonymous with Western culture, it is hard to re-excavate the fact that one is merely dealing with a beast advantaged by a measure of superior cunning, a hypertrophic facility for the transfer of information, and an opposable thumb. The meaning of humanity is abuse of the vanquished, the transformation of intensive difference into metaphysical disjunction. The libidinal sense of Platonism, for instance, is the parallelization of an intensive ascent in accordance with an exhaustive concept. Intensive spiritualization is fixed as consummate spirit, thus leveling out desire onto the stagnant plateau of theological idealism dominated by Christendom. Upon this plateau progress in extension remains possible, scientific, technical, and industrial growth for instance, but such development is rigidly constrained by its infrastructural libidinal petrification, imprisoned in the humanity whose first instance was Socrates, and whose horizontal limit is Christ. The broad strokes of Nietzsche's diagnosis are well known. I count life itself as an instinct for growth, for duration, for amassing of force, for power. Where the will to power is lacking, there is decline. My assertion is that this will is lacking for all the highest values of humanity, that decline values, nihilistic values, pursue dominion under the most hallowed names. It is the devaluation of the highest values, the convulsion at the zenith of nihilism, that aborts the human race. Having polarized the high and the low in extension, humanity finds itself destituted of its idols, which have purified themselves into overt inexistence, and is thereby plunged vertiginously into its abjected values, animality, pathology, sensuality, and materiality. At the end of human civilization there is thus a regression driven by zero, a violent spasm of relapse whose motor is the cavity of an extinct telos, the death of God. Zero religion. As a creature of zero, Overman is not a conceptually intelligible advance upon humanity. Any such thing is, in any case, strictly impossible. Humanity cannot be exacerbated, but only aborted. It is first necessary to excavate the embryonic anthropoid beast at the root of man, in order to reopen the intensive series in which it is embedded. If Overman is an ascent beyond humanity, it is only in the sense of being a redirection of its intensive fetus. This is why Overman is predominantly regressive, a step back from extension in order to leap in intensity, like the drawing back of a bowstring. Their zero is the transmission element which integrates active and reactive impulses at the end of the great Platonic divorce between nature and culture. Zero is undifferentiable without being a unity, and everything is re-engaged through zero. Eternal recurrence, the most nihilistic thought, begins everything again, as history is re-energized through the nihilistic indifferentiation between zero enthusiasm and enthusiasm for zero. Passive nihilism is the zero of religion, whilst active nihilism is the religion of the zero. On the one hand is Schopenhauer's metaphysical pessimism as a European Buddhism, on the other Nietzsche's Dionysian pessimism as the exaltation of dissolution. Within the order of bilateralized representation, the will to nothingness is of profound ambivalence. Either abolish your reverence or yourself. The latter would be nihilism, but would not the former also be nihilism? This is our question mark. Nihilism as concrete history is Christianity, and it is only because Christianity is as impossible as it is real that nature escapes from being stigmatized to its foundations by the cult of the Nazarene. Christianity is inconsistency with matter recurs consistently with matter and thus inconsistently with itself. This is the motor of nihilism, the great zero, and the impersonal generator of nature and culture in their incompossible consistency. Christianity, as Nietzsche insists over and over again in the Antichrist, is Judaism once again. Once again came the popular expectation of a Messiah into the foreground, he writes in section 40 of the Antichrist, and 2 pages later, getting a little carried away, once again the priest instinct of the Jews perpetrated the same great crime against history. Against the tide of Teutonic anti-Semitism, with its project of Hellenizing, Aryanizing, and Wagnerizing Christ, Nietzsche is obsessive in his claim that Christianity is nothing except a recurrence of Jewish monotheism, which is not a mere repetition, but a return that both exacerbates and corrodes. The Christian, this ultima ratio of the lie, is the Jew once again, 3 times even. Europe is a population whose history has fallen prey to the zealots of the one, victim to the spreading ripple from the same catastrophe of monotheism which culturally vivisected the ancient Hebrew warrior tribes into the broken rabble of apostles and first Christians, huddling in wretched destitution beneath the shadow of the cross. Once again, recurrence does not say that an identity is repeated, except when thought is devastated by the reciprocity of reason and the monologic of the same. Monotheism is not repeated, but nihilistically exacerbated by unilateral zero, and driven irresistibly into the death of God where it consummates its truth. There is a savage rigor to Nietzsche's thinking here. The little rebellious movement, baptized in the name of Jesus of Nazareth, is the Jewish instinct once again, in other words, the priest instinct, which no longer tolerates the priest as a reality, the invention of a yet more destitute form of existence, a yet more unreal vision of the world, than that which conditions the organization of a church. Christianity denies the church. When Nietzsche's loathing for Christianity reaches its crescendo, it becomes an obsessive reiteration of the one. One, over and over again, monotheism as Nietzsche calls it, a God whose speculative triad collapses everything into the one, the Father, Son, and Spirit, power, benevolence, and knowledge, the simplicity, equality, and ontological individuality of the soul. The entire universe crumpled up together by a phallic fanaticism for monolithic form. Christian Trinitarianism is the demonstration that everything comes back to one unless it is zero. To set up the question of difference as a conflict between the one and the many is a massive strategic blunder. The Occident lost its way at this point. The real issue is not one or many, but many and zero. Nietzsche writes, "Wherever there are walls I shall inscribe this eternal accusation against Christianity upon them. I can write in letters which make even the blind see. I call Christianity the one great curse, the one great instinct depravity, the one great instinct for revenge for which no expedient is sufficiently poisonous, secret, subterranean, petty. I call it the one immortal blemish of mankind. This blemish is not a scar, but a callus, because the association between God and man is a matter of industrial relations. Unitary being is the order of work. God who creates and conserves, man who toils. Theology stinks of sweat." Long before Marx, it was monotheism that hallucinated the earth into a workhouse. As soon as we imagine someone who is responsible for our being thus and thus, etc., God, nature, and therefore attribute to him the intention that we should exist and be happy or wretched, we corrupt for ourselves the innocence of becoming. We then have someone who wants to achieve something through us and with us. History is industrial history, and it only has one goal, which is God. Nihilism is the loss of this goal, the nullification of man's end, the reversion of all work to waste. It is in this sense that history is aborted by zero. There are those who in their eagerness for the continuation of effort take Nietzsche's Overman to be a new goal, a restoration of teleology, a task commensurable with the annihilation of history. Perhaps Nietzsche himself succumbs to such a temptation at times. After all, German Protestantism had poisoned his blood. It must nevertheless be insisted that the world of work perishes with the one, and that zero is an engine of war. When truth steps into the fight against the lies of millennia, we shall have seisms, spasms of earthquake, a displacement of mountain and valley, the like of which has never been dreamed. The concept of politics then passes over totally into a war of the spirit. All power edifices of the old society are blasted into the air, they all rest upon the lie. There shall be wars as there have never been upon the earth. From myself onwards, for the first time, is the great politics on the earth. Between war and industry is a unilateral difference. Industry is different from war and war once again. This is why great politics is not just an episode of war, but the very tide of recurrence in its ferocity. Nothing is great but zero, and great politics is that for which the polis itself falls victim. Nietzsche is thus utterly incapable of consenting to the Aristotelian dictum, in his Politics, that the art of war is a natural subdivision of the art of acquisition, associated with his assertion that tame animals have a better nature than wild ones. In its uninhibited and extravagant root, war does not serve the state. Even in his earliest writings, Nietzsche is explicit that the order of dependence is quite to the contrary, and that the polis, along with its telic integration, is a consequence of pre-political militarism. In a text from the early 1870s called The Greek State, Nietzsche notes that whoever contemplates war and its uniformed possibility, the military, in relation to the previously outlined essence of the state, must come to the insight that through war and the military an image, or perhaps rather a blueprint of the state is set before our eyes. Here we see, as the most general effect of the tendency to war, an immediate separation and division of chaotic masses into military castes, upon which the edifice of the warrior society raises itself, pyramidally, upon the lowest, broadest, slavish stratum. The unconscious purpose of the entire movement compels each individual under its yoke and generates even with heterogeneous natures a similar chemical transformation of their properties, until they are brought into purposive affinity. Much later, and more importantly, Zarathustra tells us, "You should love peace as a means to new wars, and the short peace more than the long one too. Do not advise you to work, rather to struggle." These are the most profound words in the history of military thought. The libidinal comprehension of peace as a unilateral differentiation from war. On its extensive or political plane, war appears as the antagonistic juxtaposition of constellated forces, but on its intensive or cosmic axis it is a metamorphosis of forces, their relative decomposition from strategic ensembles and purposes, towards tactical fragments and initiatives, dissolvent excitations at the edge of zero. The goalless pulmos of Heraclity in flux. In extension, war can appear to be oriented to appropriation, domination, and subordination, but intensively it develops according to tendencies of subtilization, infiltration, and dissolution. It is not that there is merely a desire for war, variously named by Nietzsche the thirst for destruction, the drive to destroy, anarchism, nihilism, and will to nothingness, rather that war in its intensive sense is desire itself, convulsive recurrence, unilateral zero. The three great economic discourses of modernity can be summarized under the names Marx, Freud, Clausewitz. In each case what is sought is a rigorous comprehension of surplus, and in each case this is thought of primarily as success, industrial profit, psychosexual satisfaction, or military advantage. Sex and war can seem industrial, work and war libidinal, or business and love like war. Is Lenin's reading of the First World War more convincing than Freud's, think of Junger, or than Foucault's reading of industrial history? Such questions are complex, and easily effaced in an eagerness for reduction. Furthermore, Marx already sees that political economy has its irreducibly military features, the so-called primitive accumulation, just as Freud sees that the psyche is a battlefield. Wars are produced and desired, industrial conflicts waged, commodities eroticized. The human animal seems to work, fuck, and fight, without accomplishing definition in terms of secure boundaries. Bataille does not hesitate on this question. He locates war and industry within a general economy as the respective tendencies to useless and to productive expenditure. War is the free movement of solar flow across the earth, whilst industry is its inhibition, such that war is imbued with sacred characteristics, irrationality, horror, and the incendiary glory of donation of self. This immediately contests the Leninist reduction of war to productivist motivations, siding instead with a late Freudian account of base thanatropic drives. War is not the parasite of production, less still its instrument. War is rather the prisoner of production, its repressed energy source, overflow, and implicit catastrophe. Far from being the Frankenstein monster of production, war has a solar genealogy. War is not meant here in a Clausewitzian sense, which is to say, as an instrument of policy. War in its radical sense is not an instrument of any kind, least of all a political one. The relation of war to the political is not, in reality, one of technical subordination, but rather, one of the uncircumscribed to the field of its potential circumscription. Only when it has been domesticated, and inhibited in its tropism to utter dissolution, can the sad dog we know as war be subjected to policy, as the negative potency of the state. War escapes a Clausewitzian definition therefore, although this is not to dispute the very great pertinence of Clausewitz's thought to its servile forms. Krieg is no doubt indelibly scarred by its Prussian serfdom, but this need not efface its wilder features, the cosmological nobility described by Heraclitus, and the lines of hydraulic intricacy traced by Sun Tzu. There is even an inescapable sense in which war is beautiful, especially when compared to the sordid idiocy of work, since even its abject forms spill over into something harsh, fluid, and untamed. War is a luxuriance of chances, which is quite consistent with its shattering ugliness as a loathsome vampire trailing hideous carnage, the swamp breeding ground of vermin and plague. Whatever its terrible allure, there is nothing more profoundly degrading than war. It alone is truly base. The word war derives all the crucial currents of its sense from that of being the drive to dissolution, much as Freud described it in the wake of the First World War. It is the oceanic wilderness which is always other to civilization, irrespective of the compromise formations that seem to unify them. War erupts convulsively into the history of civilizations as a loss of control, partially managed, with varying degrees of adeptness, by competing political interests. Such interruption is undergone as a dehumanizing regression, the resurfacing of an ineliminable allergy to integrity, for which man is a circumscription. It is an incidental feature of Freud's account that one sees even the armed contest of the European underscore states as a massively inhibited lurch towards the free-flow fundamental violence of desire. Civilization, with its attendant militarism, is war subject to repression, and the energy of war is thanatos, base hydraulics. The chronological tendency of Bataille's writings is one of demilitarization, with the ardor for insurrectionary war that typifies his early polemics being rapidly phased out of his text from the early 1940s onwards, although not with the decisiveness he himself suggests. The sacrificial exigency becomes increasingly interpreted as one of forestalling war, slipping precariously towards the abject status of a means to the preservation of peace. Whatever interest such political contortions might have from the perspective of reconstructive biography and retrospective moral pontification, their consequences for the development of general economics is of vanishing insignificance. Whether we approve or disapprove of war is, after all, scarcely the issue. Anything of which we can approve is, in any case, less than war, Disputation over this question is superfluous. War is hideous evil, and to affirm it is to cease to be human. War is not an evil, but evil itself. Every reckless debauching of humanity's productive resources has a military character, compacted from anarchic violence, senseless prodigality, contestation, regression, contagion, and heterogeneity. This is why criminality has an archaic sense as aggression against the community, whose relics survive in banditry and the military infrastructure of penal forms, and why the unconscious is metaphorized spontaneously as an insurgency. Sardes orgies share this military principle, governed dissolvently by force, treachery, sacrificial glory, and filth. It is the collapse of the centralized pacification of the populace which is at once the historical and literary space of the Sadian text, the uneven disintegration of society into armed packs, bands of robbers, and outlaws, as heterogeneous forces crisscross the disinterred battlefields of the decomposing regime, trailing vice, disorder, and ruin in their wake. War is unreason, but what is reason? It is something like a pearl, the symptom of a protracted irritation. When a people becomes philosophical, there is always an institution of torture to be found. In the Occidental world, the basic implement of this torture, the very chamber or territorium of cruelty, has been called the soul. Like a black, damp, and freezing cell, it has always been a torment in itself. Europe has been chained in the soul, dangling with bleeding wrists, until it lusted for destruction with a foul and parched thirst. Inspired by the symbol of its gibbeted god, it has been a perpetual crusade. With the immense, almost inexplicable energy that stems from control fury, the philosophers have tended the carnivorous worm gnawing at our brains. Perhaps they thought that if they could sate it with an ethics, its devouring would diminish for a while, but such judgment attests to a severe deterioration of the military instinct. The attempt to bargain is already a devastating defeat. To acknowledge weakness, to await response, to fend. These are all incompetent positions to adopt. At the level of tactics, it might sometimes be necessary to fall back into a defensive posture, but grand strategy begins and ends with a commitment to initiative, to the offensive. Pragmatism is finally indissociable from aggression. Due to a strategic idiocy on the part of its philosophers, Europe has tried to make peace with its soul, yet remorselessly stimulated. The mutilation continues, and with each bite we suffer and endure itself. The dissipation of the soul would not relate to thought as an object of theoretical representation. There would be something almost touching about Hegel's clutching for philosophical Ordlösung if it were not so pitifully stupid. It takes only the most rudimentary psychology to know that for as long as I think, theory will be merely a brutal jest, a way of baiting the nervous system into an apoplexy. Whatever is thought in the grim mode of responsibility can only be registered as a grating aggravation, because it is precisely the ego which is unable to dissolve itself in thinking, clattering with its chains through labyrinths of confession, transforming energy flux into representation, into frustration. When we speak, it rattles like a jagged stone in our throats. A little over 2 millennia ago we began to cough up strange new words with our blood and bile, and in certain quarters the excruciation of libido began to be called philosophy. These Germans have employed fearful means to make themselves a memory, in order to become masters of their basic instincts and their brutal crudity. One thinks about the old German punishments, stoning for instance. The sagas already allow for a millstone to be dropped upon the head of the guilty, breaking on the wheel, the most authentic invention and speciality of German genius in the realm of punishment, piercing with stakes, tearing or trampling with horses, quartering, boiling the criminal in oil or wine. Still in the 14th and 15th century, the well-loved flaying, cutting with thongs, cutting flesh out of the breast. One also covered evildoer with honey and left him to the flies in the burning sun. With the help of such images and procedures, one finally kept 5 or 6 I will nots in the memory, in relation to which one has given one's word, in order to live under the advantages of society. And really, with the help of this type of memory, one came finally to reason, reason, seriousness, mastery over the effects, this entire gloomy business called reflection, all these privileges and adornments of men, how dearly they have been made to pay for them. How much blood and horror is at the base of all good things. Philosophers are vivisectors, surgeons who have evaded the Hippocratic moderation. They have the precise and reptilian intelligence shared by all those who experiment with living things. Perhaps there is nothing quite as deeply frozen as the sentiment of a true philosopher, for it is necessary to be quite dispassionate if one is to find things theoretically intriguing. Strong thought is always experimentation in the severe style, cut, then watch. It is not easy to be the friend, or the body, of a philosopher. They have always understood that if one is not amused by suffering, there is little point in attempting to reason. It is the great pain, that long slow pain which takes its time, and in which we are burnt as by greenwood, that first drives us, we philosophers, to climb into our final depth, and to do away with all trust, everything good-natured, veiling, mild, average, in which, perhaps, we previously located a humanity. I doubt whether such pain improves but I know that it makes us deeper. Remorselessness is a word that is quite quickly and easily said. To perform it against oneself and others is harder. It could scarcely be said to be a virtue, it has no hopes, and it hurts. One would be surprised, perhaps, to encounter it often. Yet the bleak compulsion for the desert, for sterile austerity, is somehow perpetually regenerated, as if there were a diffuse and inarticulate longing for the futility of obsession. Given a sufficiently terrible history, in which useless sacrifice has become automatic, uninteresting, such nihilism is easy to explain. If one wants to be available for thought, a stringent and icy code is requisite. One must first learn to develop a predatory sense for anything comforting that could be excised from one's life. For instance, all the little luxuries that, once savored, have become habitual, every residue of leisure and indulgence buried in routines, and every relic of ancient mollifications, even when these are disguised as disciplines, as chastisements, as despair. Since the human being is a social animal, it is inevitable that, pushed beyond a certain threshold, its solitude will become a destitution for it. If one is to generate thinkers, this must be exacerbated to the extreme. One must seek to eradicate the capacity for love, or rather, since this is unrealistic, one must infuse it with a harsh and paralyzing cynicism. It is of particular importance that all traces of tenderness, that most dangerously blissful effect, be ground rigorously into the dirt. Life must be stripped down to its bare frame, and there is always something to be eliminated that one had mistakenly thought was architectural, but which was in fact quite different, merely a reinforcement. For it is only in being allowed to fall that a structure discovers its emaciated erectness, its spine. Philosophy is a discipline. It takes only the most casual reading of Nietzsche's genealogy to begin to take this word seriously, to detect its mixed aroma of sweetness and putridity that betrays innumerable spillages of blood. In addition, for those trained by Nietzsche into a more acute genealogical sensitivity, splicing refinement with a tense sickness of the nerves, a fuller panoply of odors becomes detectable, the sharp sting of fermented pain, the mustiness of prolonged despair, and the rich rankness, luxuriant in its metaphysical resonances, that only ripens in the miasma of frequent and premature death. There are few, if any, who could gaze unflinchingly into the laboratory of human cultures, but then, this is scarcely an option, the true training process of the intellect is not on display. Those fragments of atrocity that accidentally remain exposed, whether due to the vaunting of a defeated enemy's bestiality, intestine conflicts within a power apparatus, the disruptive effects of natural catastrophe, or some other reason of this kind, must function as symptoms of a generally buried horror. If disciplinary violence is to be effective, it is crucial that it be without justification, and thus indifferent to teleology, either positive or negative. It must not seem as if anything is wanted. For the most direct way of softening a tool is to begin to give it reasons, eventually it begins to think it has a right to reasons. Suffering must be obviously futile if it is to be educational. It is for this reason that our history is so unintelligible, and indeed, nothing that was true has ever made sense. Why was so much pain necessary? We foolishly ask. But it is precisely because history has made no sense that we have learnt from it, and the lesson remains a brutal one. Useless suffering has always been Europe's practical philosophy, our true evangelium, communicated to every cranny of the earth with unparalleled dedication. After all, it is the secret of so many things. So much power becomes accessible at the point where one loses all capability to enjoy it, and better the misery of the master than the wretchedness of the slave. Thus it is that entering the space of reason has always required that one spit upon the fierce pleasures of the savages, resigning oneself instead to an infinite vacuity. Academic prose has the remarkable capacity to plunge one into a sublime dystopian nightmare. Is anything this appalling really possible? One asks. What happened to these people? Is it part of some elaborate joke perhaps? Or do they just hate books? There is a sense in which one can only admire their ability to make Nietzsche seem like a bank manager, but ill like an occupational therapist, or Derrida a world historic, but in the end one vomits. Such writing is unparalleled as an introduction to despair. A universe in which it is possible condemns itself. With trembling fingers one turns the pages. We have really come to this, one only has to read genuine scholarship to be racked by ardent dreams of incinerated cities. Bataille's Zur Nietzsche stands alone in the salt flats of Nietzsche reception. There is no generic term that fails to insult in this context. One of Søren's casual jokes is of inestimably greater value in making contact with Nietzsche than the whole of Heidegger's ponderously irrelevant Nietzsche. The exceptions are rare enough. Klossowski's Nietzsche Cirkelvisiaks was better written than not, even though it stinks of transcendental philosophy, and Deleuze's Nietzsche and philosophy is saved by being solely about Deleuze, an academic who can think. Otherwise there is only an almost mystical vacuity, the gibberings of a lobotomy ward. Upon encountering Zur Nietzsche one flips through the pages with mounting excitement, no sign of scholarship or servility, prose that burns like an ember in the void, precision, profundity, esprit. The shock is almost lethal. The euphoria blazes painfully for weeks. At last. A book whose aberration is on the scale of Nietzsche's own, a sick and lonely book. The fact that such a book could be published even dampens one's enthusiasm for the universal eradication of the species. How were the slapstick Nietzscheans going to punish Bataille for writing a beautiful and profound book about their master? The answer is simple, one merely extrapolates from their lack of imagination. Let us do the same thing again, they squeal happily, let us bury him. Let us be ever so professional in our dealings with this dangerous animal, and nurture another limping dwarf. Superficially, Bataille's engagement with Nietzsche is difficult to locate. He has no sympathy for the announcement of the Overman, his exoteric reading of eternal recurrence is hasty and crude, and that of will to power dismissive. He takes the thought of Overman to be a residual spectre of idealist productivism, and in his early essay The Old Mole, on the prefix Zur in Surrealism and Surrealism, but not overkill, he aligns it with the aspirational element in Surrealism, a position he never revised. Eternal recurrence he considers to be an emotivating tactic, exhausted by its negative function. In Zur Nietzsche he associates it with an acceptation that is not preceded by any effort. As for will to power, what need for an impulse to the accumulation of force on a planet drowned in solar luxuriance? It is not any positive doctrine, therefore, that lures Bataille into the labyrinth of Nietzsche's writing. He is drawn down into these texts by their own labyrinthine character, and by the nihilist religion that haunts them, which he approaches through the death of God, and entitles The Will to Chance. The will to chance is not an addition to the archive of philosophical concepts. It is first of all the subsidence of Zur Nietzsche from discursive responsibility into a patchwork of quotations, theoretical passages, poems, aphorisms, fragments, and diary extracts, much written in the first person. In this way it protracts the disintegrative virulence of Nietzsche's writings with an exuberance quite alien to the pedants of the academy. In Bataille's communion with Nietzsche something occurs that is utterly incommensurable with commentary, exegesis, or interpretation. If community does not exist, he writes, Mr. Nietzsche is a philosopher. Zur Nietzsche, like Nietzsche's own texts, is a space of community rather than a contribution to a body of scholarly work. My life, in company with Nietzsche, is a community, my book is that community. Not a study, therefore, but a pact against industry, a reactivation of a war. And if Nietzsche is to be labelled a philosopher it is only in the violently paradoxical guise of the philosopher of evil. Against the abortive consolidation of Kantian industrialism associated with Hegel and teleology, Bataille counterposes Nietzsche and the naked risk of chaos, war, eroticism, and surrender to the sacred. There is nothing I want except chance, certainly not salvation therefore, or anything associated with God who by definition, is not in play. The will to chance no longer resents the irresponsibility of immanence, and Nietzsche figures as the attestation that unlike God, man is not condemned to condemn. Devotion, prayer, hope, or faith are all violently corroded by the will to chance, which relapses towards immanence, and immanence is impiety itself. Bataille protects nothing, one cannot offend against the sacred, I love irreligion, the disrespect of putting in play. Nevertheless, there is no religion that is not a chance, and no morality that is not chance's denial. Morality is the domain of tasks, whilst religion dissolves itself in fate. The will to chance is the sacrifice of the will. This is not to say that the will enacts its own end, since any act of surrender merely consolidates humanity, extending the range of its possibilities into negation. Unlike any act, the will to chance resists the order of the possible, but even its resistance is involuntary, a fatality of working evil, in disorder. Between chance and the will is impossibility or unilateral difference, such that the succumbing of the will is itself succumbed to as a chance. Chance is everything that no agent can do, and its range is only circumscribed by fictions, although dense ones. It is the same as time, collapse of individuated being into communication. Being, humans, are not able to communicate, live, than outside of themselves. And as they must communicate, they must will this evil, this pollution, which, putting their own beings into play, renders them penetrable one to the other. Chance is not a pre-ontological archer reserve of possibilities, and to think of it as such is merely to displace ontology, reducing chance to randomness once again. A chance has no essence outside its instantiation, which is merely an assertion of the elementary anti-Platonism sufficient in principle, were it not in fact unintelligible, for the generation of minimally materialist thought. Chance is not some kind of infra, super, or being, and there is no sense at all in which it surreptitiously is. The ground of the accident is even more accidental than the accident itself. Chance is far less a fundament than a betrayal, at once radical and gratuitous, whereby being falls prey to its indeterminate exactness. Being derives only a vanishing speck of its contingency from the fact that it is haunted by the logical spectre of an eliminative negativity. The overwhelmingly preponderant part of its deviance stems from its irresolvable composition, beyond which there is only idealist phantasmatics. If being is conceptualized, through submission to logical functions, either that of opposition to nullity, or distinction from arbitrary specification, it is idealistically reconstructed in a process that is one with the repression of chance. What separates space materialism from the scholastic differentiation between composition and creation, culminating in the Heideggerian meditation upon being, is its realism, in accepting that being is only what it is. In other words, being is indeterminably or intensely unnecessary. That being is a chance means that it is logically intolerant, starving almost the entire field of possibility of the resource for actualization. The real context for being's logic, ontology, is famine. It is in this sense that Spinozism provides such a decisive paradigm for the theoretical decompression of intensity, since it is programmed by the meticulous refusal of being's logical intolerance, a necessity for one writing of Deus sive natura. It is perhaps only here that Spinoza succumbs abjectly to the tradition, blinding himself to the vertiginous modal skewing which attests to the psychosis of God, and impresses itself upon materialist thought as violence and cum. It is not that Nietzsche pronounces upon chance in a way that Bataille comes to decode, but rather that in Nietzsche's text chance decouples itself from the prison of probability, exploding in its luxuriant immensity. Nietzsche's writing is not a doctrine, but a convulsion of hazard, breaking open the cage of Kant's nihil negativism to float in a positive insanity, dissolved and free. As early as 1936, in his article Sacrifices, Bataille explores such a cosmic anti-logic, in which irresolvable improbability, irrational negation, and interminable compositional intricacy are interwoven. When compared with the play of combination occurring at an inferior stratum of composition, every being is an improbability so violent that Bataille labels it chance. If there were a final stratum of eventuation, chance would be subordinated to statistical principles, but something quite other is the case. An aberrant space which Bataille, borrowing one of Nietzsche's favorite metaphors, refers to consistently as the labyrinth,